Welcome to the Ty Beal Show, where we discuss food, science, and life. I'm Ty Beal, a scientist at the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition, or GAIN. My guest today is Dr. Walter Willett, a renowned nutritional epidemiologist at Harvard University. Dr. Willett has published over 2,000 original research papers and is the most cited nutritionist worldwide. In our conversation, we discuss the 2025 EAT-Lancet Commission, ultra-processed foods, and seed oils. A quick note before we start. This podcast is separate from my role at GAIN. Okay, let's dive in. Dr. Walter Willett, welcome to the show.
Great to be with you, Ty.
So you are highly regarded as the most cited nutritionist worldwide. So before we dive into your groundbreaking research, I'd really love for listeners to get to know the person behind the science. Can you tell us a bit about your life outside the lab or outside the computer where you do research? Do you have family traditions around food that shaped your early relationship with nutrition? And what do you enjoy doing when you're not analyzing data, writing papers?
Okay. Well, food has been part of our family for generations. Our family has a farm. I'm still in the family. My cousin has it now in Michigan, up in the Thumb. It's been there since about 1880. And wow. It was a place I visited regularly when we were growing up. We lived across the state on the other side of Michigan most of the time. But my father was an agriculture researcher. I was on the faculty at Michigan State University in dairy science, actually. And I grew up having a garden and being in 4-H. I got lots of blue ribbons at the county fair. And we lived initially on a research farm. So I could milk a cow when I was 4 years old. Wow. I don't know if that is worth anything. I'm not sure I could today. But so food and agriculture has been part of my background for a long time. I started off studying physics and food science at Michigan State University, then went to medical school at University of Michigan, came to Boston to do internship and residency, spent 3 years in Tanzania teaching internal medicine and public health. I came back to the doctoral degree in epidemiology, and at that time started working on actually what I'm doing now, which is looking at the long-term effects of diet using epidemiologic approaches. And I was chair of the Department of Nutrition for 25 years at Harvard. I very happily turned it off to my great postdoc, Frank Koo, about 8 years ago. And so I'm mostly focusing on the research, teaching, when I have a chance, do some bike riding and other hiking, things like that.
Awesome. Well, that's quite a long career. We'll talk about a lot of this stuff, but I want to dig into something that's really exciting and new this year, the 2025 EAT-Lancet Commission, which is it's been a long time coming, and there was a report in 2019, which was the original EAT-Lancet Commission report. So before we get into this new report that's coming out this year, can you tell us a little bit about the original report and what was that all about?
Yes, actually, that was something I'd been wanting to do for quite a while, really to bring together healthy eating and also sustainable food systems. But I just wasn't able to find a time, or definitely didn't have all the expertise needed to do that. So fortunately, the Wellcome Trust funded the EAT-Lancet Commission, which allowed us to bring together 35 scientists from 17 different countries around the world. And that was really important to have that expertise from not just nutrition, but also agriculture, earth sciences, food sciences. And we published, as you say, the first report in 2019. And shortly thereafter, we realized that probably people would want an update on that. The first report did have a big impact. Really, I think it's fair to say, much more than anything that I've worked on any other of my many commissions and groups and reports that we all do over time. Partly because I think it was just the moment that was ripe for this kind of integration of health effects and environmental effects related to what we eat. And it's been cited over 10,000 times, and actually is in the top 10 papers ever cited by policy documents. I didn't know there was some index for that, but there is. I was
Impressive.
informed a year or so ago. So it's gotten attention, but the whole scene is moving rapidly, and we realized anybody would want to have an update if they thought this topic was important, because the environmental changes are happening rapidly. And of course, research is happening, and people making decisions personally or for institutions would want to know that they have the best up-to-date information. So that's the primary reason for doing this update, is to make sure that what we said in 2019 is still current, or if there's corrections or updates or tweaks that should be made. But also there's several areas that we wanted to develop further. One is justice, that this is a big issue on the global scene. I think Americans may not appreciate that too much, but in low and middle income countries, they are suffering, I think even more than we are here, the effects of climate change and other environmental impacts. About 2/3 related to fossil fuel consumption, but about 1/3 related to food systems. And so they're paying the price for what has really been done, the damage done both by excessive fossil fuel consumption in the United States and Europe, and also the food system, too, that we are having bigger than our share. If you look at our per capita consumption for the environmental impacts of both fossil fuel use and food systems as well. So we briefly alluded to that in the first report, but we're developing that aspect further. Also, just given the word limit that Lancet gave us in the first report, we couldn't develop as well as we would have liked to the issue about how do you implement healthy and sustainable diets around the world in different cultures, different geographical contexts. And so we've tried to do that more the second time around. The second report will be released October 3rd. Maybe you'll be listening to this on October 3rd, or maybe sooner, but maybe you'll already heard this. But we are planning to have the release then. And I must say, one of the reasons we did have more impact than other reports was that the EAT Foundation did a really good job at working with media, working with other organizations after the report came out. When I do something for the National Academy of Sciences, the report comes out, it's there on the web, but it's mostly sits on a shelf. There's no real effort made to disseminate the findings, and the EAT Foundation did a really good job.
So this original report, it was really a landmark report. I remember the day it came out. I had colleagues sending me this report, and we were all talking about it. Right? It was very prominent in our field. So that report was really bringing together for the first time, how do we achieve this sort of planetary health diet approach of what's something that's healthy for humans and good for the planet that fits within the planetary boundaries, right? Could you, before we talk about a little bit more detail about this report this year, can you tell us maybe at a high level, if you were maybe on the elevator with someone or just having a 1 or 2 minute conversation, what would you say is sort of the key findings or implications in a simple way for people to absorb?
Well, this I'm recording before the report, so I can't give you exactly the key findings here, but I think it's fair to say that if you've been following the literature, what you'll find is that the basic description of what we call the planetary health diet, which is a simple description of the overall dietary pattern. It's meant to be as flexible as possible, make a tent as big as possible for everything from being a vegan to being an omnivore, but still more on the plant side, more some people have called it plant forward.
Hmm.
The literature since that time has really supported that this dietary pattern is related to health effects. In the first report, we couldn't, just given the timing, it really came together at sort of at the last minute as it usually does. And
Yeah.
so we really couldn't test it out to look within populations at whether people who adhere more to that dietary pattern have better health outcomes. And
Hmm.
we've published on this, and I think fair to say dozens of other groups have published on that issue. How does adherence to the planetary health dietary pattern relate to health outcomes? And very
Yeah.
consistently have found benefits for a wide variety of outcomes. One of the most important key messages has already been published, that greater adherence in our longitudinal data with 30 years of follow-up in large cohorts, over 200,000 people, repeated measurements. There's about a 30% reduction in overall mortality for the highest decile compared to the lowest decile. And when we look at all the major causes of death, heart disease, cancer, respiratory disease, neurodegenerative conditions, kidney diseases, those are, every one of them is inversely related to, risk is inversely related to greater adherence to the planetary health dietary
Hmm.
pattern. And then in a report we published a little while ago, we found that if everyone could come close to adhering to that pattern globally, it would prevent, we estimate, about 27% of overall premature deaths, which comes out to be about 15 million premature deaths per year. So the
Yeah.
impact is potentially large of greater adherence to this planetary health pattern. But one message is it's not all or nothing, that every step you move in that direction was related to better health outcomes.
Okay.
So importantly, we have some studies from around the world, several studies published from China recently that are very consistent with that pattern.
Right. And I think for listeners who don't know, the current diets around the world are pretty unhealthy. They're not the best diets. So, like you're saying, any movement in this direction is going to be good. And the more you can do this, the better. I want to just simplify this sort of the 2019 report. Can you give us an overview? You said it's flexible. So there are sort of midpoint ranges for sort of an overall diet, but you have high values, low values, right? So can you tell us about what does the diet look like, and what are some maybe different examples of some variations that you might see within that adherence?
Sure. And it's a little bit hard in one table. We've struggled with this, how to condense all the variability and interaction of diet into one table. And we've actually tried to add a little bit more explanation there, because few people sort of looked at that and said, well, you could go to the high end of all the animal-based foods, but no, that's not what the intent was. That was meant for each of those food groups, like red meat or eggs or fish. You could have that range, but you have to then adjust other factors if you can't just keep adding. We have one plate. We have each person, their energy range is pretty well regulated, quite tightly regulated, in fact.
Yeah.
So if you're going to change one thing, you've got to change something else. But overall, the big picture is that the target numbers come to be about 2 servings of animal sources of protein per day. I find that really in my mind, when I'm thinking about what I'm going to eat, I find that a healthy reference. I happen to be an omnivore.
Okay.
So that could be about 1 serving of dairy a day, a glass of milk or an equivalent amount of cheese, for example, then one of something else, which could be fish a couple of times a week, poultry a couple of times a week. But red meat, which has big health impacts and also big and huge environmental impacts, keeping that about 1 serving of red meat per week. So each of those could be adjusted up and down, but having that About 2 servings a day is something that I didn't realize that when we published the first paper, but looking back at it a year or so later, I realized actually we go through all these numbers, all these calculations, and that's what it comes down to
It's
be.
pretty simple when you say it like that, because I think when you get into grams and ounces, people start scratching their head like, well, how am I going to have this little amount in one? But what you're talking about is 2 servings of animal source foods a day, animal products. That could be, like you said, some yogurt or milk or cheese with some sort of meat or fish. Now, the other foods, we're talking about plant-based foods, which are whole grains, legumes like beans, peas, lentils, nuts, seeds, soy products, fruits, vegetables, right? So are there specific changes to those? So when we look at all these different categories, when you did this new analysis, did you find, actually, based on some sort of health information or environmental impact, we really want to adjust some of the previous recommendations in 2019?
Yes, we did look at all these food groups again, and importantly, as you mentioned, I was talking about the animal source protein specifically, but that's for our population in the U.S., that's quite a bit lower than the current intake would be. So that would mean for us consuming more nuts, more legumes, including soy products. And variety has always been a principle in nutrition for almost ever. And actually, the more I look at it, the more I think, yeah, that's a really good principle, because it means that you're less likely to be missing something, and you're also less likely to be getting too much of something, because almost everything, any essential nutrient, you can get too much, and that can't be. That's not always healthy. Sometimes actually harmful to be getting too much. So in almost all diets around the world, we did see that it would be, from a health standpoint, desirable to increase nut consumption, increase legume consumption. We looked at of course, as I think everyone is aware, the red meat issue is somewhat controversial. There's obviously huge agroeconomic interest behind consuming more red meat, and there is nutritional value to red meat as well. But we see excessive risks for quite a few diseases pretty linearly related to higher red meat consumption. So that's the reason it's on the low side. We updated our analysis. We did publish about a year ago looking at the relation between red meat and type 2 diabetes. And we've used that as an indicator, because there are many, many studies do confirm that association between red meat consumption and risk of type 2 diabetes. So we have a lot of data. And also in our own cohorts, we had over 22,000 people develop type 2 diabetes during follow-up. So we could get good precision, statistical precision, looking at the dose-response relationship. And when we updated it, we came out to a little bit lower number for red meat than we had before, but we left it as we had before, because there's no absolute exact number we are talking about.
Right. You're going to get criticized no matter what from different sides, right? Because this is a big attention report. There's a lot of interest, and people really, food is personal for people, right? And it feels like, oh, well, I don't want to be told to eat just this amount of that or whatnot. So I think when people see a number, you're gonna ruffle some feathers. I was really interested to know in the first report. I think, if you can correct me if I'm wrong, but the amount of whole grains had a huge range. Something from almost 0 to like 60%. I mean, I don't remember exactly the percentage, but can you talk a little bit about the thinking behind that? Okay, because whole grains are generally recommended in healthy diets. You've published a lot with your colleague David Ludwig, who is a proponent of ketogenic or lower carb diets for some purposes, right? Can you tell us, can a sort of lower carb diet be compatible with the EAT-Lancet approach, the Planetary health diet approach? And what is sort of an example of maybe higher carb, lower carb that fits within the framework?
Right. That's a big controversial topic, as you pointed out. Actually, you're right. We did have a wide range. And the intent there was to recognize that whole grains are not essential But the really important point is that whatever grains we have, that they be primarily almost entirely whole grains. We do see adverse effects of refined grains. That they're depleted in nutrients and have high glycemic load. So refined grains are something really to keep low. So the really important point was to the extent that you're eating grains, to have them as whole grains. And also, we did try to keep total carbohydrate intake under about 60% of calories. Again, there's no sharp division there, but at higher carbohydrate intake, which is really the diets of the lowest income, low income groups around the world, really poverty diets tend to be very high in carbohydrate because they're usually the cheapest form of calories. And we've been concerned for a long time about anti-nutrient effects from high carbohydrate intakes, and there may be more anti-nutrient effects if they're whole grains. That's a possibility. So, and they also displace a variety of food, having more variation. So we didn't want to go to extremely high carbohydrate intake. And several studies by other people, ourselves, have suggested we really start to get into trouble with higher than something like 60% of calories from carbohydrate. And also on the whole grain side, we did want to, we kept that low because it is possible to have a healthy low carbohydrate diet, but not the sort of conventional low carbohydrate diet that's loaded with red meat and animal sourced foods. But you can have a low carbohydrate diet that's pretty healthy, actually, where the protein sources would be nuts to a large extent, salads with, say, plant oil dressing on it, olive oil, other kinds of dressings on it, some some fish intake, modest amounts of poultry intake that would be very consistent with a planetary health diet. So we wanted to not exclude that kind of pattern. Again, we were trying to make the tent as big as possible here that's both healthy and sustainable. You may see in this update that we didn't go to zero on the carbohydrate and the whole grain because the evidence, as you say, has come in that there really are positive effects of whole grains. So we're, in general, trying to encourage that. But it is, there are some dietary patterns if we look around the world, like in Uganda, where the primary carbohydrate source are plantains and may actually have very little grain intake. So there are some examples if you look around the world, although the vast majority of people do get most of their carbohydrates from grains if we look around them. We did, I think, identify some gaps in knowledge. We talk about whole grains, but actually, if you look at the literature, this is usually whole grains from wheat and related oats, barley, from the traditional grains of Western cultures. And maize is technically a whole grain, the way it's consumed in Mexico. But we actually don't really have much data on whole grain maize. So that's a gap. There are some studies, our colleagues in Mexico actually are collecting that data. Hopefully for the next update, we'll have some more. But I think we sort of made the assumption that whole grains are created equal, but they may not be. So there's still more work to do.
There's a lot of limited data on what people are eating in terms of grains, and are they whole or refined? I know that's a big challenge to understand. I want to talk a little bit. Yeah, go ahead.
It's also a source of confusion, too, that we realized that some countries were reporting quite high whole grain intake, and on the ground, that's not what we see. India, for example, and there it seems to be a definition that people are calling something rice whole grain, just if it's not pounded into flour. It can be the germ can be gone, the bran can be gone, and still call it whole grain, but that's not the technical definition. So
they're hearing the survey and they think, okay, white rice it's a whole grain, right? It's a kernel.
So there's data sources that are not well. If you start to get into this in detail, you realize we need better data across the board for almost everything. So
Absolutely.
this
Yeah.
is the best available data, but it's not perfect.
Yeah. Okay. So I want to highlight some things you mentioned, which I think EAT-Lancet, like you said, the original report and the one coming out, it's gotten so much attention that inevitably you have people who sort of criticize, critique it, or have different views. And so one of the things that I think what I'm hearing you say is you really strive to not have a one size fits all diet approach. Everybody needs to be vegan or everybody needs to be high carb. I think that's sometimes a misconception. You're saying, in general, plant forward, predominantly plants, but having, 2 servings of animal source foods, allowing flexibility where some people may consume quite a bit of their calories, maybe half of their calories or so from carbohydrates or from whole grains. Others may be quite a bit lower, right? So you can have a little bit more on the lower carb with the nuts and the fish and some plant oils and poultry, etc. So I think that's important for people to hear. I want to talk a little bit more about the particular type of whole grain. I know Carlos Monteiro, who was sort of the founder or the creator of the NOVA system on ultra processed foods, is part of the second commission this year. And I want to know, when I look at whole grains, I see such different products. Of course, in the US, I'm looking at US and my daughters are in public school. And for breakfast, there is cinnamon rolls and they're whole grains, but they've been highly processed. They've been combined with, sugar and whatnot. And it's not really the whole grain that you would think of in terms of maybe a bowl of oatmeal or a piece of whole grain bread, right? Can you talk to us about how do you sort of translate that nuance when you're recommending so that people aren't just thinking, okay, well, as long as it's whole grain, any form, it's fair game.
Right. This is definitions and misunderstandings abound here in this area. And it is complicated in how to convey something that's in a simple way that's not too simple. That's always our challenge in nutrition.
Yeah.
And of course, some of these, the cinnamon bun may be, and we have weak labeling definitions in this country. First of all, something can be called whole grain if it's at least 51% whole grain. That meets the FDA definition, which is not what we're talking about. We are talking actually real whole grain, not 51%. And sometimes the food is described, and I guess it seems to be legal, that whole grain refers to the grain that's in it, even if it's 2/3 sugar, but not the real whole grain content
right
there. So the labeling in this area is really confusing to the average person. And there has been some attempt to try to do better. There's the Whole Grain Council, you may be aware of, that has a sort of certificate with a couple of different levels of whole grain in it, but they're 100% whole grain would mean the whole product is whole grain. So I think that's an improvement compared to what is actually used by the FDA at this point in time. But the ultra-processed food definition, I think, is quite problematic in itself. And you can imagine we had lots of discussions about this. But part of the problem is that something can be not ultra-processed by the current NOVA definition and be really unhealthy. If I go to my local bakery here, it's local, but it's all white bread, all refined grain and loaded with sodium, but it's not ultra-processed. So whereas I go to Trader Joe's and I can get some ultra-processed bread, it's actually pretty good. It's whole grain, really no refined grains in it. But by definition, it's an ultra-processed food. So I think there's serious issues with the definition it's currently used, and it's not simple. Actually, for decades, people have been trying to come up with a definition of junk food, and we all realize there's a huge amount of unhealthy food that is overly processed, but there's a lot of food that is really not healthy, but it's not fitting this definition of ultra processed. So I'm afraid industry can play and do some workarounds to, depending on what the definition is.
Yeah.
I think we've learned a lot about food processing actually, and in some ways the ultra processed idea is getting it ignores the main things we know. Actually, refining of grains probably the biggest damage from processing, and that's not part of the definition of ultra processed. Adding excessive amounts of sodium is a huge problem, well documented. That's not part of the definition.
Yeah.
Excessive amount of sugar isn't part of the definition. So uh, those, I think, those are aspects that are well recognized, and I think we focusing on those would be where the science is very strong and really not disputed. That can get us a long way to
Hmm.
looking at identifying unhealthy foods.
Yeah. So what you're saying is the whole debate about whole grain, it's confusing because labeling policies, how the public interprets that is very different, and people don't really understand that. In the U.S., you can have a product that is really full of refined sugar. It's maybe 51% whole grain, 49% refined grain, and it's essentially a dessert. And it's marketed and packaged as whole grain.
Yeah.
What you're saying is 100% whole grain, meaning you're not going to have any of the refined grain in there. It's really 100%, or it's all whole grain. And then paying attention to these really important categories that the NOVA classification system doesn't really address. So refined grains, sodium content, added sugar, right? So you're saying there's a need for more nuance in this definition. I know that there are currently researchers looking into this. Of course, the FDA and the USDA have put out a call right now to try to work on a definition of ultra processed foods. Your interaction with Carlos Monteiro in this EAT-Lancet 2, I'll call it, a report for this year. Did you have any conclusion, at least for now, until we have better frameworks? Did you have any conclusion about ultra processed foods in the report that we can expect to see?
Well, you have that one thing. You'll have to wait till our report comes out.
Okay.
But I think there is broad consensus about emphasizing minimally processed, primarily whole foods to the extent we can. I think there is very broad consensus about that, and that's mostly minimally processed whole foods, because some processing is actually helpful, and it's not that all processing is bad. Some for preservation, shelf life, those are practical issues, especially if we live in a cold climate where there's not fresh fruits in our backyard all year round. We have to have preservation, transportation, to have healthy foods all year round, and that's contributed to better health that we have today compared to 50, 60 years ago. So we need smart processing that it really is processing that it emphasizes preserving the nutritional value of foods. Also, something that came up a lot and partly critique of the first EAT-Lancet report that we have tried to address in a little more detail, and others have looked at this in research papers, is cost and convenience. There are reasons why people consume processed foods. Many people just don't have time to go shopping. That's time consuming, and prepare foods from scratch on a day-to-day basis. That sort of worked in the 1950s when the wife was expected to stay at home and prepare food and take care of children. But that doesn't describe most contemporary families around the world. And many people really have to scramble 2 jobs to try to afford a healthy meals at all.
Right.
And there was also criticism that the EAT-Lancet diet couldn't be afforded by a third of the world's population. So cost is a real issue. And many of these highly processed foods are cheaper than fresh fruit or whole foods would be, partly because they're made from so much refined starch and sugar, which are
Right.
the cheapest ingredients of all. Uh,
Yeah.
and we do need to recognize cost and convenience. We've one important analysis done by some investigators at Tufts showed that the EAT-Lancet diet is not more expensive than national dietary guidelines in general in poor countries. So this isn't
Hmm.
more expensive, and in general, it should be less expensive than the trend toward eating more animal source foods that's
Right.
happening
Because
in
they're
many
more
countries.
expensive. Yeah, I think people will probably want to know that healthy diets in general, they can cost more, obviously, than other potential diets because people may want to consume more expensive products like animal products, or if you're like you said initially here, if you are poor and you can't afford to eat the right type of diverse foods that you need, you depend on maybe a starchy staple for most of your calories. That's much cheaper. So of course, if you recommend a diet that's very diverse in all sorts of different foods, it's going to be more than that baseline cost. But what you're saying is it's not really that different from dietary guidelines around the world, right? And what you're saying is you're actually adding in this component of not just the health, but also the environmental impact so that we have more of a sustainable approach to eating.
That's right. Absolutely right. And we ultimately we definitely need to pay attention to affordability of diets, and that's the job of civil society and governments to be sure that people can afford a basic healthy diet, which isn't the case in many countries, and increasingly isn't the case even in the United States, which is we're a wealthy
Yeah.
country, and that's not always possible.
Yeah. So you mentioned anti-nutrients, and I want to talk a little bit about what those are. So these are, things like phytate, which binds with minerals like iron and zinc, and it can hinder their absorption. Now, when you look at the sort of the very the midpoint average, of the 2019 diet, you do see high amounts of phytate, so anywhere from maybe 2,000 to 2,500 milligrams. That does reduce bioavailability. Can you tell us in EAT-Lancet 2, what can we expect around modeling and estimates to understand, are these diets fully nutrient adequate? And are there maybe ways to supplement or fortify in ways to fill in any gaps? For example, if you have I know that you have an option where you can go down to fully plant-based, which, would be like a vegan diet. We know that you can't really get B12 from plant sources. So that would require some form of supplementation or fortification. Can you tell us a little bit about what the nutrient adequacy looks like of this new report this year?
Yeah, we've given some more detailed analysis to the nutrient adequacy issue, and the especially as you mentioned, if one goes much below about this 2 servings a day, then you really are at risk of having inadequate vitamin B12, and that's
And you're talking about 2 servings a day of animal products. Just want to clarify for people.
Thank you. Yes, right. If you go much below that, then you do, I think, risk running short on B12. And we've also done nutrient analyses adjusting for phytate intake and anti-nutrient intake. Our basic reference diet looks like, in general, that will be nutrient adequate, nutritionally adequate. But our basic evidence is based primarily on foods rather than on nutrient adequacy numbers. But we've looked at nutrient adequacy sort of as a cautionary and looking for red flags or yellow flags there where we might want to pay some extra attention. And I say partly that's because I think, as you're well aware, that nutrient adequacy depends on lots of things besides just the food. And the varieties of the food can vary quite a bit. I mean, some grains have a lot of iron, some have very little. Some have higher phytate content. And also, adequacy depends a lot on infectious diseases that can hinder absorption and create blood loss. Hookworm, for example, or malaria in parts of the world are real issues. and conditions that affect absorption in other ways. So I think we can't just look at a number and say a diet is we can be sure that this is nutritionally adequate in any one country or any
Right.
food system. So it is really important to have active surveillance around the world. And we're actually totally separate, are working on a project with Rockefeller Foundation to try to set up a regional laboratory example where more evaluation of nutrient adequacy biochemically could be built into surveys. The surveys of intake are really important, but we really should be monitoring in a better way we are biochemical nutrient adequacy where around the world. We're not doing that today.
That's really great to hear because, as you know, when you measure adequacy of a food supply, through these food and agricultural food balance sheets, you get one story. When you look at dietary intake through surveys like 24-hour recalls, you get another picture. When you look at biomarkers in the body, you get something different, and they don't always correspond. So what you're saying is the actual status in the body is most important because there's a lot of factors that can influence absorption, and we won't go into all of those, but really important to look at the biochemical data. I also want to talk about this.
You've really done some nice work there to show that these are correlated, but not perfectly correlated, the intake and the biomarkers. But you also mentioned what to do about it. And if there is low intake, I think first to look at the foods. Can we encourage some food patterns that might deal with the adequacy issue in a better way? There are some places where there are plant sources, I'm learning about this too, that do contain a good amount of vitamin B12, and particularly some algal products, blue foods that do that. But then fortification, biofortification, supplementation, all those things should be on the table because there's usually not one solution that will be best for every food system.
Yeah. So I'm hearing that it's a food first approach because there's a lot of things that we get from food beyond just their nutrients, but also looking at sort of fortification and supplementation as a safety net. From my understanding, the algal form of B12 is not bioavailable the same way, but you can get supplements. You can have fortified foods and absolutely meet all of your B12 needs. So you don't have to have animal products to do that. You just have to be intentional about it. I also want to mention what you're sharing about this sort of 2 servings a day. As you get lower, you can do that, and you have some potential benefits to maybe it's on the chronic disease side, cardiovascular disease, those types of things. But you do run the risk when it's sort of cutting out any type of food group too much, like you're saying. This concept of diversity is a safer bet. And what I think many people in the US and in wealthier countries don't realize is that actually in many contexts in South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, many of the populations are consuming 1 serving per day or less of animal source foods. So what you're saying is there's this inequity around the world that has to be sort of accounted for. You use this word justice, right? That's one of the big issues here. We have really high consumption in certain contexts of some of these animal products, and you have really low consumption. And that low consumption is really just due to poverty. We know that people want to consume more to be able to have a moderate intake, but they can't really afford it. So what you're sort of describing, I'll sort of wrap this discussion up, is that the EAT-Lancet Planetary Health Diet, the new commission coming out this year, it's not trying to be dogmatic or saying there's a one-size-fits-all approach. Everyone has to be, high carb or vegan or something like that. But it's really trying to say, look, we need to shift. We need to shift from where we are towards this approach for both for our own health and for the planet. And your studies that you've published even recently have really shown that it's really about moderation with animal source foods. It's not about, you don't need to completely limit, but it's sort of moderating them for optimal health. I think that's something people can often miss when they maybe look at headlines or they look at a particular value for one particular food group like red meat or something, right? And also what you're mentioning is that you're trying to make these flexible for different contexts and nutrient adequate. And to achieve nutrient adequacy depends on the context. So if you try to model something for one country, the actual nutrient content in the actual foods that they can eat varies quite a lot, right? So it's going to be different. Even if you have one leafy green versus one type of bean or legume, it really can vary. So I want to get into another topic that's also, this is probably very controversial, but we've heard a lot about seed oils in the public today. And these are oils like soybean oil, canola oil, there's many others that we can talk about. But can you tell us what are the different variations of seed oils and how do they differ?
Right. That's this is an area that somehow there needs to be a sociologist and get involved here because there's if you look at the internet, and actually one of my colleagues did a SGP chat to describe a healthy diet, and it said avoid seed oils among the other things.
I have to say on that topic, I asked ChatGPT, Claude, Gemini, DeepSeek. I asked like Grok, all of the AIs, I asked them, are seed oils healthy? And all of them unanimously said yes. So I just want to say that from the start that, even though sometimes, yes, they can pick up some of the social media stuff. When I did ask in sort of a generic way, they are generally in consensus about that.
Oh, well, that's good to know. I hadn't done that test.
But maybe if you ask them on Tuesday, they'll say one thing. If you ask them on Friday, it's something different.
Right.
Who knows?
Yeah. Well, that's interesting. And I think that is the right answer. That seed oils are in general healthy. It is, but somehow there is this myth out there in the web that seems to be taken up by our Secretary of HHS and condemning seed oils, and therefore we should load up on tallow and lard and butter, which would be, yes, that would be taking us back to the 1950s, 1960s, when heart disease rates were 4 to 5 times higher than they are today. The multiple factors have contributed to the decline in heart disease, but it's dramatic. It's not just that mortality rates from heart disease are dramatically lower, but actually autopsies on young adults who got killed in military action showed dramatic reductions since the 1950s in atherosclerosis, actually in the arteries there. Mm-hmm. So it's not just the rate; you can actually see the dramatic change in atherosclerosis, and people are living 10 years longer. We don't want to go back to where we were.
So let's dig into some of these issues, because I know that there's going to be listeners who are going to want to hear the perspective on some of these more these nuances. So, like what you said is that the rates of heart disease has actually declined substantially, and it's not just the change from these saturated oil, fats to seed oils, but that is part of it. So there's other things like obviously medications, healthcare, things like that. So another thing that happened at the same time was a drastic change in the type of foods that we have available and these more ultra processed foods. And so you can see that when you look at the trend in the USDA data, when you look at this in the food balance sheet data from the Food and Agriculture Organization, you can look at sort of what we're calling seed oils, which, soybean oil, I think, is the most common one, but you got canola, you got corn, all sorts of oils. These have been increasing substantially, right? And at the same time, we've seen this obesity epidemic happen. So, if you don't look into it from sort of like a critical perspective or more nuanced, you can say, oh, look, as these seed oils increase, obesity, diabetes, all went up too. Can you distill what's going on there and why you don't think it's the seed oils?
Yeah, well, there are, when you look at the trends, I think as you described, what's happened is that coronary heart disease, the number one cause of death in the 50s and 60s, and even still today, it is number one, even though the rates have gone down, because all deaths have gone down a lot. Yeah. We've made some big progress. But when we talk about ultra-processed foods, actually, the really important one that's most important is not a food, it's a beverage. It's sugar-sweetened beverages. And that's gone up dramatically since that time. That is the biggest driver, no question about it. And I estimated back of the envelope kind of calculation that the rise in the sugar-sweetened beverages could just alone count for about half of the obesity rates that we have now, which are they're now about 43% of adults are obese. When I started
Which,
working,
thankfully, Walter, there is very little debate about the health risk of sugar-sweetened beverages. If there's one thing that all of the crowds from the carnivore, keto, vegan, most people can agree, at least in this space, that sugar-sweetened beverages they have no nutritional value and they only increase risk for disease.
right? Yeah, absolutely, and we should keep that right in the center of what we're looking at here, because a lot of people talk about ultra-processed foods, but actually the biggest problem is sugar-sweetened beverage, not a food per se. And when we create these scores of ultra-processed food intake, what's really driving this in most of our analyses is sugar-sweetened beverages, and secondly, processed meat, which there's pretty major consensus that that's a problem too. Those are really the big factors, overwhelmingly. But what you say over time has happened. We've dramatically reduced heart disease rates, but obesity and diabetes, the things that follow from excessive weight, have gone up dramatically. Obesity was 10% about when I started working in this area in the 1960s, and it's over 40% now. So a huge change. And we haven't paid the full price yet for that increase in obesity, because there are lags of 30 or 40 years before we see all the health complications of that gain in obesity that we've had. So what's driving that is it's not magical that what's driving it. There is this huge increase in consumption of sugar-sweetened beverages, and total carbohydrate intake has gone up somewhat. This was partly a problem of the demonization of all fats in the diet that was straying off the guidelines, got off the track in the 1980s and 1990s there, and without attention to the form of carbohydrate in the diet. So the big change in the diet has been an increase in carbohydrate intake, and most of it unhealthy carbohydrates, refined starch, mostly refined starch. Actually, sugar consumption has not gone up as much as refined starch has been.
Refined starch sort of gets a pass, right? Because it's not sugar,
right?
It's just sort of slipped in everywhere, and it doesn't count. It doesn't make something ultra processed. So refined, I mean, that's one of the probably biggest issues, other than sugar sweetened beverages, that sort of gets a pass, even with a product that's 51% whole grain.
Right.
Consumers don't know that it has 49% refined grains in it, right? They're not picking up on that.
Interestingly, part of that is that it's not been actually a variable in most databases until very recently. So if it's not in the database, it doesn't get analyzed. It's invisible. So it's interesting how as you say, we had a blind spot with refined grains. So they're definitely part of the problem with obesity. One thing that there's been debate about, but I think it's unequivocal, that the change in exercise pattern, activity pattern, has been profound. We don't have good measurements of that over time, but when I was growing up, nobody watched television. There was one television set, I remember, a few blocks away from us, and it was a little 6-inch round screen that we could look through the window and see somebody watching it. That was it. And it's just completely changed. And that's sort of been, again, if it's not monitored and tracked, we don't pay attention to it. But that's been profound. And it's not just the loss of activity, but the really sophisticated manipulation and marketing, especially to children, through that, and now, of course, other kinds of media as well. So multiple drivers. It's not that there's something magical that we're missing out there that is driving this obesity epidemic. And other countries have taken better control of this, actually. That if you look at France and Italy, they have about half the rates that we do. They've still gone up, and they're concerned. They're have been doing a lot about it, and it's plateaued. It looks like in those countries at about 20-25% adults. So there's a lot we can be doing about this, even though details, there's still something to be learned, but there's a lot we can act upon today.
So focusing on seed oils is the wrong focus, but I still want to address some of the concerns that I know people will have, which I want to talk about specifically now about how they're processed. So There are concerns, at least from some, that oxidative damage could be happening because they're not super stable if they're a high heat temperature, or maybe some of the additives like solvents like hexane or other chemicals. So, from your perspective, is there any concern around it when it comes in the packaged form? Is there any concern about oxidative damage? Is there any concern about maybe some of the chemicals or solvents that might be remaining in the oils in any sort of dose that could be harmful?
Yeah, those are real concerns. And in principle, I would just go back and one step just on the evidence about seed oils, that the biggest rationale for being concerned or even saying that seed oils are harmful is omega-6 fatty acids are pro-inflammatory. And that is completely refutable because there have been literally dozens of studies that have looked at this, including about 15 or more randomized trials, I think more now, that was in a publication a while ago. And very consistently, omega-6 fatty acids do not increase inflammatory factors. About half the studies show a reduction in inflammatory factors. And we've known for 70 years that seed oils reduce LDL cholesterol. That's a really important risk factor. Seed oils reduce it. And in our long-term epidemiologic study, we see that plant oils, as long as they're not partially hydrogenated, are related to lower risk of cardiovascular disease in almost every major outcome we look at, including total mortality.
So the evidence, what you're saying is the evidence is really pretty strong and robust that they have health benefits compared to things that they replace.
Yeah, this should not be something that's arguable or debatable. The evidence is really very, very strong. Yeah. But the fourth, I mentioned three major problems with processing. The fourth is partial hydrogenation that created trans fat. And that was actually focused quite a bit of our research from the very beginning in our studies. And fortunately, it's now illegal. It was mostly gone by the 2018 when
thankfully in the US it is illegal, but there's actually a global advocacy needed because a lot of countries still don't really have the right type of regulation. So I think you're absolutely right in the US, but we still work to do.
It's still an issue in some places, although even in some of the places we didn't know about, one of my colleagues in Tanzania, I wasn't sure there, but they did a survey. We analyzed the samples and their food products there, the margarines, the cooking oils were very, very low trans fat now. So
good.
Even though there's no regulations, quite a few countries, there has been a major reduction.
And I imagine the industry, when you make a change in the U.S., it does have effects around the world because you're going to adjust your products, right?
That's
overall.
Right. It's not to say that's not a problem in a few places. It still is, but there've been major progress. But you can really damage. Seed oils, and that was a huge issue. But you're raising the question about the possible damage to those oils, and they are sensitive. These are critical molecules. They're building blocks for every cell in our body, and they're the building blocks for a lot of hormones that regulate inflammation, cardiac rhythms, and lots of critical biological functions. So we really do need to treat seed oils gently. Like most precious, biologically important things, they're precious, and we need to respect that. But the conditions that are used now, quite a while ago, we took corn oil and fried with it and did in our kitchen and did all kinds of things and ran it, and we couldn't see any damage to the corn oil.
So let's just pause here for clarity. So there are two different, times at which there could be potential damage, at least where people are concerned, right? So there's the production of the oil itself. So in the treatment, but what you're saying, and then there's when you cook with it. What you're saying is in a home environment or a lab environment where you sort of have the product, so it's already gone through the processing, the industrial processing, and you cook with it, you still couldn't find a lot of oxidative damage. Now, is that from cooking like a saute type thing? What way?
Right. Yeah. Cooking this, we would usually doing in the home in a frying pan, that kind of that kind of
Yeah.
cooking, and you're right that there are the earlier steps where the partial hydrogenation occurred, and there was an issue. It's an interesting, a little yellow flag that there was, even with trans fat gone, or mostly gone, the partial hydrogenation, the process that was main process that created trans fat purposefully, that's gone. But my colleagues in the Netherlands did find that the deodorization process of the oils, that if you have soybean oil, raw corn oil, there are flavors that our consumers apparently don't like. And so they do a process called deodorization that is a combination of temperature and time. And they found that alpha-linolenic acid was being converted to trans alpha-linolenic acid, and even in quite small amounts did elevate blood cholesterol levels. So it does reinforce that these are delicate molecules, and they did change their processing steps, and very carefully. This was Unilever actually did some really good work on this and show that if you're careful about it, you don't create those trans ALA molecules as well. So we need to keep an eye on this. This whole industrial chain that you're talking about.
Yeah.
Hexane, other extraction processes, there basically is not allowable hexane in the oils that are used now. And I guess most reassuringly, in our large studies that we've been following, when we look at what people are actually eating off the shelves, there's really major reductions in cardiovascular disease, total mortality. So sort of the real life experience is that these are healthy, but it should not. This is something I would like to keep monitoring, because we are dealing with critical, delicate molecules, and we want to make sure that we don't go off track someplace.
I want to highlight this because what you're saying is the overall health effects of these oils, when you look at products actually in the real world, is overwhelmingly positive. Now, there are some particular contexts where something like deodorization in a particular product at some time could have had some issue with oxidative damage or converting some ALA to trans fat. But that doesn't mean that the majority of the products have any substantial amount to where you're going to actually pick that up in the health data. And so something to monitor, we need to have standards, I'm sure, and make sure industry is accountable for delivering products that are free from trans fat and do not have oxidative damage. There's another issue that people talk about, which is in the sort of fast food process of repeated deep frying. So these oils have, antioxidants like vitamin E as well, which can protect somewhat. But these oils, like you're saying, are very sensitive. Now, they do lower LDL cholesterol compared to something like an animal fat like tallow or lard. Can you walk us through, because this is actually happening, and this is a debate, deep frying repeatedly, right? You have a fryer, maybe it's not changed out even over the entire day. I don't know how frequently they are, what the regulations are, but if something like French fries are repeatedly deep fried in seed oil that's highly sensitive to oxidative damage, is that potentially going to make that product worse for health than tallow or lard being used? Or would you say overall it's still healthier to be deep fried in these seed oils? And can you explain why?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. And I think we don't have the ultimate answer to that yet. We need to, I think, keep following our cohorts that we actually have monitored over time the amount of trans fat in McDonald's French fries and Burger King French fries, actually.
Wow.
And they were almost gone by 2010. So that, there's no sharp. It was just stepwise down from the early 1990s, stepwise decrease. So there's no sudden date when they were gone, and we, I think, need another 5-10 years of follow up till we can really know how these products in the post-trans fat era are related to health outcomes. So there are There are huge changes. You can um, a- uh, take a little fat sample with a needle from somebody now, and they're different biochemically than they were 30 years ago, which is
Hmm.
interesting. We have really transformed the physical body of almost every American and probably almost everybody around the world now in a way
Wow.
that overall is being helpful. But there's ways that we could go off track, and including uh, uh, just being a little off track from your question here, but a lot of these products that are being used for deep frying now are uh, purposely lower in omega-3 fatty acids because it's really the omega-3 fatty acids that are by far the most susceptible to this
Right.
oxidative kind of damage that you're talking. So purposely, the oils are either by GMO processes or by selective breeding lower in omega-3 fatty acids. Now, there were essentially almost no omega-3 fatty acids existing after partial hydrogenation. They were destroyed almost entirely. So there's more omega-3 fatty acids in these oils than there were in the trans fat era. And they could be more susceptible to damage. It's ironically, people are concerned about the omega-6. It's really the omega-3 fatty
Okay.
acids that are susceptible to most susceptible to oxidation.
Okay.
So I don't know the final answer to that, but again, uh, so far overall, the plant oils as they're being used overall are looking healthy.
So if you show up to a McDonald's, which I'm sure you don't do regularly, but you have the option between these the seed oil French fries and the tallow or the lard French
yeah,
fries. Which ones are you going to buy?
yeah, I'm going to go with the seed oil ones.
Okay.
That we do know that tallow is not good. Actually, a lot of people are appropriately concerned about the trans fat, about the saturated fat in the tallow. But what's actually really more important is that, perhaps more important, is that it contains almost no essential fatty acids, omega-6 or omega-3. And
So
if
lack of the polyunsaturated fatty acids. So Walter, you have had an incredible career over many decades. What is the most important thing you take away from your career and time spent studying nutrition? And what would you want to be your lasting contribution to the field?
Well, good question. And I think, first of all, I would say that everything I've been able to accomplish has really been partly, to a large extent, because of working with other people who brought ideas,
Hmm.
brought actual work, energy, and creativity here. So this has really been a combined effort with a lot of colleagues over time. Perhaps most importantly is that our work has shown that we really can measure diet in large populations. From the very beginning, we were not totally sure about that, and that was the biggest critique holding nutritional epidemiology back. Some people said people can't remember anything that they ate, and there's no between person variation. And we did document that.
Hmm.
We knew we couldn't measure diet perfectly, but we can measure it reasonably well, and we've continued to fine tune our methods and have shown over time that we can. So that was fundamentally important. And then
Yeah.
also some other methodologic issues in the analysis of dietary data, the critical role of adjusting for energy intake, uh, substitution or comparisons in our analyses. As you would do in a randomized trial, you always have a comparison group, but epidemiology was not doing that initially. And in terms of some of the applications, the trans fat work was, I think, probably one of the most important pieces. And that it was, uh, we were looked at this because some people uh, had raised concerns about trans fat. It was definitely not on the main radar screen of nutritional science, but so from the beginning, it took quite a bit of work. We actually had to create a database, had to set up a big 100-meter column for measuring trans fat in food uh, and tissue. And so we were able to show that trans fat was related to uh, coronary heart disease in quite a strong way that had, of course, caused a lot of debate at that initial publication, but it was confirmed by many people over time.
Yeah.
Another major substantive area was showing that uh, total fat intake was not the biggest problem in the American diet. When we started in 1980, that the main recommendation was avoid all fat in the diet. That it's all bad. And what we really did find that total fat is almost meaningless from a health standpoint. It's really the type of fat that's
Hmm.
important. And total fat can vary a lot and still be healthy. And unfortunately, that emphasis on reduction of total fat encouraged consumption of a lot of unhealthy carbohydrate intake. So we showed that both the quality of the fat and the quality of carbohydrates are really important. And that has been embedded in pretty much all dietary guidelines. Now, it wasn't the case when we started. So, anyway, well, I guess also more broadly, that what we found is really initially starting from a base of looking at heart disease, that was the number one problem. That was where almost all the attention on diet was concentrated, and for good reasons. It was so important. But we've seen that diet is important for almost every outcome, every health outcome that we've looked at, whether it be cancer and neurodegenerative disease. We're doing quite a bit of work on that now. Uh, uh, Gallstones, kidney stones, almost again, every organ of the body is influenced by what we eat. So the importance of diet is much more broad and much more important than we realized in the beginning. So anyway, it's
Yeah.
been an interesting trip, still learning. And as things change, there's new issues that keep arising.
Well, that's an impressive career, and you've had quite an impact. I imagine you are going to keep working as long as you can. I see publications coming out from you all the time. So really appreciate your effort. And thank you, Walter, for taking the time to speak with me. I really enjoyed it.
Well, thanks, Ty, and I'm glad you're out there keeping attention on diet, activity, and environment. We clearly have a lot of work ahead of us.
Indeed. All right. Thanks so much.